Welcome to ELA's Wednesday Walks in the Garden. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance. We hope these virtual garden walks add a bit of beauty to your day and inspire you to garden and enjoy the nature around you in whatever area you're in. On today's garden walk, we explore growing vertically with edible and ornamental plants with Irene Barber. Irene is the Adult Education Program Manager and Horticultural Therapist at Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens in Boothbay, Maine, where she designs and maintains vertical gardens in the universally accessible Lerner Garden of the Five Senses. Irene is also the owner and landscape designer of Greenscapes Design LLC in Durham, Maine, specializing in therapeutic, accessible, and ecological outdoor living environments for private and public settings. Welcome, Irene.
Thank you very much, Penny, and thank you for everyone who was able to make it today to attend and that you were interested in this topic. It seems to be an ever-growing topic, and it's something that I thought we should present for ELA. So Penny jumped on it. So thanks, Penny. So today I'm going to give you a virtual tour of some examples of virtual gardens, of vertical gardens, and concepts of what vertical gardens consists of. It's not necessarily something that's always in soil, and so I just wanted to preface that it's not necessarily soil that's filled vertically. A lot of plants we have grow vertically. So I wanted to illustrate and showcase the diversity and versatility of what growing vertically really relates to. And then this also will equate to those systems that are sometimes a little more elaborate and a little bit more expensive. And then we're going to talk about those systems that are a little bit more budget conscious and possibly more feasible for a specific application. So that is important to recognize that vertical gardens aren't perfect for every setting. So we want to definitely be judicious in identifying that. So I work, as Penny mentioned, at Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens, and we have a number of vertical systems there. We have 3 that are actually set up in the Garden of the Five Senses, and this is a setup, if you can see in the picture here, of some walls that are wonderful for my horticultural therapy program. And we change them out every year to spice it up, to keep things interesting for our visitors as they return year after year. And honestly, the area that we have them in isn't necessarily the most conducive for certain plants to overwinter. So I'll be talking about that as well. So why grow in vertical systems? There are so many opportunities of which vertical gardens provide privacy. They provide a cooling impact to an otherwise urban, very hot environment that may not have a lot of permeable green ground, perhaps. They also provide some wonderful, accents, vertical accents to otherwise very flat spaces. So, and they provide this kind of living tapestry that you can really enjoy the textures and the aromas close up to your nose instead of having to bend down all the time. I also love them because they close in sound from beyond. So if you're near a road perhaps, or you're in the city, it insulates sound from really coming in. I should say it actually prevents sound from coming in, and kind of creates your environment to be a much more intimate and kind of a secret garden approach to living in that outdoor environment. Now, there are challenges to what vertical gardens can entail, and that is soil depth. So why do we traditionally like to grow in ground? Well, first off, it has an insulation factor for our overwintering plants, particularly in New England. And there's just a little bit more of a nutrient opportunity that is sustained throughout a long period of time based off of using soil that is true soil and not a soilless media. And vertical gardens, for the most part, utilize soilless media, and I'll be talking about soilless media. Certainly the benefits of having vertical gardens versus that of in-ground is that we don't have to bend as often. We don't have to lean over or, you know, stress out our upper body. We don't have to worry about, you know, maybe we have arthritis in our knees, so we don't have to bend down with our knees as much. Traditional in-ground situations definitely, they basically incline us to be more physically engaged to an environment where we have to go up and down and carry and lift and weed. That's the other thing. Vertical gardens are fantastic for the fact that you really don't have to weed. So every so often, a chipmunk or a bird will nest in a vertical garden section and leave some seeds, and all of a sudden you have an oak tree growing out of it, but at least it's very visible, very noticeable, and easy to pluck out. So again, benefits of growing in ground versus that of growing vertically is, at least with soil going up vertically, is the fact that it has a great insulation and more stabilized growing environment year round. So I'll get into talking about plants that are conducive to being grown in ground year-round in a vertical system. But it's not just the plants, again, it's also the setting. So I'll be getting into that. But for sure, in-ground provides a lot more of that reliability and predictability of tolerance coming back year after year. So some systems I wanted to identify. There are traditional trellises that we think about. There are these pockets. Have any of you seen those woolly pockets that are out there? There's one that's called the Wally Grow or the Woolly Grow, I think. There are wall cells and boxes. So basically these plastic kind of bracket type of features that you can actually mount onto a wall of any sort, whether it's brick or wood. And you can create different levels and create tiers in that case. Instead of having one large inclusive vertical system, it seems more of a puzzle piece if you wanted to make it that way. There are these famous things called these reclaimed pallets that are happening out there. And they have pros and cons, and I will discuss some of those pros and cons. But it's a great way to repurpose a pallet that would otherwise be perhaps burned in a burn pile. Just remember to always sterilize your pallet before you plant into it, so that way you are not inviting the environment for ants to persist that were perhaps already there, or even some diseases perhaps. Then there are the vertical garden pots. So there are pots in which they can stack on top of each other. And you can create pyramids if you want, or you can just have a strawberry planter, for instance, that has many little pockets. I don't know if any of you have seen that. Oh, I've already forgotten the name of it, but it's basically an oversized strawberry concept of growing plants that grows up to about, I mean, it reaches up to about 7 or 8 feet tall, and it has all these little pockets that are you can actually turn if you wanted to for access as well. Troughs are similar to that of window boxes. So you can have them as a ladder style where you have troughs tapering, battering backwards up as you go up the ascent, and then you have the troughs being able to have enough sunlight. So we'll show a few images of those as well. Then there are, in our case, at Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens, something that's a bit between the wall cells and the wire lattice. And wire lattice is basically a one inclusive bit of wire. You know, basically it can be 3/16, it can be chicken wire, poly-coated, but it's basically enclosing and enveloping soil as you fill up. You basically, I'll get into some images, but you basically have a bottom point of your vertical garden, and you unroll the wire, and as you're unrolling the wire, you can stuff coir and potting soil into there, and then keep securing it. And then you have basically a large tapestry of soil that you can then plug in your plants that way. And I will give you some examples of that. At Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens, we use a wire that's an enclosure, and it's actually the same material that lobster crates are made out of. And in Maine, we have plenty of that kind of wire. So here's some of the examples of living walls that are more about a true system, and an inclusive system that's all one, or you have these separated. So basically the troughs and the pockets are kind of more of these separated spaces where the soil is actually defined in these little composite areas, whereas a panel like you see on the left is a scenario where you have that wire that I was telling you about, and it's basically matted down over some sphagnum moss, or you can use coir and potting medium if you want. And then once that is laid out and stabilized, then you plug in your succulents. And it looks beautiful initially, but I don't know if any of you have had success with using succulents in the walls for a very long period of time, but they end up getting quite top heavy, some of them, especially the Ioniums and the Echeverias. So obviously these are not perennials to us, but if you are interested in doing a succulent vertical garden, just think about the long-term maintenance. These are not, just static, pretty looking textural images. These are living organisms that that do flower, and as they flower, they emerge longer stems, and so they kind of start to weigh their plant downward, so to say. So it's something to keep in mind that you're not going to just let it be. You do need to do some maintenance to those succulents over time, but it does look gorgeous initially and for a few weeks, and then as things grow, you still have to do your maintenance. So what I like to think about is I get inspiration from the traditional forms of growing plants and the habits of specific plants. So that of vines, for instance. Climbing hydrangea is a wonderful vine that actually roots into anything that's pretty much porous, as many of you probably know. So I think about that as far as, if it's going to only root and stabilize its root system at one point, or is it going to root as it crawls along, in which case is wonderful for an erosion control opportunity. And vertical gardens would be an example of, basically making sure the soil does not pour out as rain or weather systems, erode the soil at all if it's exposed to the air, latent air. So climbing hydrangea is a great idea. Also, clematis. Now there are the clematis that are the summer clematis. There are the paniculata and virginiana that are more of the late summer into the fall clematis. But these aren't really rooting into anything specific other than in the ground. They are actually just winding their tendrils around, their stems around. So they're not necessarily rooting into any additional soil. So just keep that in mind. But just the vertical interest of that color and the habit of those plants, I really like to draw inspiration from those habits. So just here's some examples of how vines can just be a vertical garden for us. It doesn't have to be this elaborate soil system that's going vertically. It's just a matter of putting soil at the base and allowing for the vines to grow up. I mean, I feel like that is something that we oftentimes forget as garden designers, is thinking about going up with plants rather than just hardscape elements. So keeping that in mind, the bigger the trough, or the bigger the area of which the plant is actually planted into, the better the insulation capacity it will have to just remain there over winter, without us having to worry about taking it out and replacing it year after year. The top left picture is ivy. I'm not a huge proponent of English ivy. However, think about Virginia creeper or Boston ivy. These are wonderful natives that we could take advantage of. There are a number of native vines that we could certainly, you know, we have Dutchman's pipe, we have our fox grape, our native grapes. We could use hops if you wanted to. So it's not just these, you know, glorious floriferous roses or English ivy that we're talking about, or clematis, although Clematis virginiana would be one of our natives that we could take advantage of for growing vertically for us. And then, you know, you can plant at the base of that vining structure if you felt inclined to. I loved this image in the center. This is at the Berkshire Botanical Gardens in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And just these simple tutors are wonderful features to think about including in your garden for vertical accents. And another thing on the right is just to demonstrate that lattice doesn't have to be the typical Home Depot lattice. Like, we really should think about how we can create lattice to be an artwork form, a form of artwork, so that while the plants are really starting to crawl up there, there's something still very attractive about that lattice, rather than just seeing a bunch of 2-inch grid systems. So again, here are some examples of some vine opportunities. On the bottom left is a wonderful picture of Thunbergia, which is, in this case, it's the black-eyed Susan vine. This was taken in South Carolina, and they made a bamboo tunnel for the children's garden here, and just allowing the vegetation to grow over that and crawl over it and then down the other side. It is a great opportunity for, you know, covering up just that hardscape element of the bamboo. And being that the bamboo has some nice seams in between, the vine can crawl through it and really grab a hold of it and keep itself going in the direction that the bamboo is porous and has those seams available. Again, on the right here, we have the Virginia creeper and the Boston ivy, and this is in Georgia, at the Atlanta Botanic Garden in, I think it's Gainesville, Georgia, actually. And again, where there's vertical pervious surface or something to grab a hold onto, those tendrils will definitely do that. Boston ivy is one of those plants that will root into anything that is porous. So keep that in mind, that it's similar to that of a climbing hydrangea. So I just wanted to give some examples of even vines that are edible. So this is in a greenhouse in Maine, and we have the climbing beans. So think about hyacinth bean. Oh, I love hyacinth bean, lab. If any of you have been to Monticello, where he has those amazing, or the garden estate has these amazing teepees or tutors of hyacinth bean. That would be a wonderful accent for an interim of time. So if you were to say you wanted a perennial vertical garden, but you didn't have a large budget perhaps to fill in with a ton of perennials, get some fast growing vines like these beans that are annual. And then they can fill in the gaps while your perennials are going to acclimate and adapt and then start to fill out even more. So you could utilize, say, Allegheny spurge which is a perennial ground cover, and you could use that with the lab, since they like to have kind of the similar growing environments. Doesn't have to be in full sun for lab to succeed. But you could have that lab while the Allegheny spurge is basically adapting and getting settled into that vertical garden space. You could use also scarlet runner bean. That's a wonderful one. Cardinal flower bean, which is in the Epomea, not the cardinal flower of lobelia, but the Epomea one. Tons of Epomeas, or Ipomea, however you want to pronounce it, which is morning glory vine varieties. you can also, take advantage of these really neat louvered fence systems and let those become the supports of your vertical vine garden environments. We've also had luck with trumpet vine in a scenario like this. Again, that's not native, but a trumpet vine is very robust, and just, almost there on the same scale as wisteria. And I think the color of that red would be incredibly gorgeous with that, kind of red-brown louvered tone that's going on in that garden. And you notice how there's different layers in this kind of planter on the bottom right. So that's important to identify as the opportunity to create layers in your vertical concepts. And we're getting into we'll get to those vertical garden systems that are more elaborate in a moment. But again, just a scenario of how tall vines can get and how you can mix them up so that they are seasonally complementary to one another. This was a year and a half after planting these 3-gallon vines. And we have a mixture of the honeysuckle vines with Clematis paniculatas, Clematis virginiana, and actually a Euonymus fortunae, which is a good winter creeper vine, which provides a good evergreen opportunity as well. I love getting inspiration from Monet's garden. I mean, can't get enough from that estate garden. This was taken, I don't know, about, I guess, 4 years ago now, and just seeing those early blooming clematis. I think it's the Mylene or Maline clematis, that nice pink that has a beautiful, very pronounced pointy capsule bud, and then it emerges out to this very pronounced star flower. And it's blooming for about 3 to 4 weeks, starting in the middle of May here in Maine. So, and I think we're probably a week or two behind schedule of the Massachusetts or the southern New England area. But although this year we may be in the same wavelength, as we're early everywhere, it seems like. So just having these structures are really important to think about. Make sure whatever structures you are building or designing for these vines, they're going to be really strong. They are going to be constructively, permanent, in the sense that you don't have to worry about replacing them. That's something very important to consider, is the material timeline for its durability. So, iron is wonderful. They use a Rust-Oleum paint on it. That's the only real maintenance here, is dealing with the Rust-Oleum paint. And so sometimes you have to peel your vines away, or you do it in the dormant season, and you're very diligent about, not like killing the vine stems with the toxicity of Rust-Oleum. Here are some really great opportunities that I feel like we could really grow in the New England area, is including more espaliers, and they seem to be getting more popular these days. Every nursery seems to be carrying them. There are, 3 to 6 different grafted varieties on a 3-tiered espalier. Personally, I like to have one type of fruit on one espalier, just because I want to have a little bit more of a predictable structural integrity of the espalier itself. Because if you have variations of fruit sizes on one side to another, then it can get the espalier a little bit more imbalanced. So I would keep that in mind, as I really think having a sole species of an espalier is a good idea, or at least know the fruits are at least equivalent in size, so that way you're not straining the structure of that espalier. But these grow incredibly fast once established. So there is one thing to consider, is your comfort zone, or your client's comfort zone, with pruning. So just remember that pruning can be done early, just like any fruit tree. Pruning can be done very diligently and almost to the point where you think, God, did I leave anything left on that branch? But actually you've left just plenty, and it just resprouts beautifully. There is that trick though, you don't want to encourage a lot of suckers. So definitely make sure you get comfortable with your pruning methods. But when you have the method down, it's a pruning time of about twice a season, so that it's really not going to become a mop head, perhaps, of foliage, and that you can still see the tiers somewhat. But they do provide some nice interruption and privacy to a courtyard urban environment. So in this case, yes, you could do a vertical garden that has more of a fence all the way up and soil all the way up, but that is a lot more expensive. So just keep that in mind. So espaliers can be basket weaved, they can be candelabra, they can be a fan. There's so many different versions of pruning and grafting for espalier habit. And this is taken over at Dow Botanical Gardens in Michigan. And I would recommend that botanical garden, by the way. It's really incredible. They have this, I think it's like 200-foot long espalier system, and it's mainly apples. But you can espalier pretty much any type of tree as long as you get it at an age at which you either have grafted yourself, or you can actually train a tree to just be more lateral, and then you maintain that habit as it develops into the mature state. But it's just a matter of getting it at an age where the branches are nice and pliable and flexible, that you can weigh them down either with a wired roping that you tie to it, or you can, some people just use strings with rock weights at the base, so it kind of pushes down on the branching structure. So there are many different opportunities for training young trees that don't actually have to be grafted per se. For instance, I was looking at some young Cercis canadensis red buds. Oh my gosh, they already have such great lateral branching to them. Or Nyssa sylvatica, if you get black tupelo young enough, again, very lateral branching. I saw an American linden that was beautifully fanned already, and I was like, all right, I'm going for that. I'm going to do it. So pagoda dogwoods or Carolina silver bells. I've actually espaliered red twig dogwood as just a fanned form. And so, yes, they are very vigorous growers. So that is a little bit more of a maintenance, issue, is that the more vigorous a grower is in the sense of its rate of growth, generally speaking, it's going to be a higher maintenance kind of plant to espalier. So those slow growing trees like Nyssa sylvatica could be a really good opportunity for you to grow as an espalier if you chose. Cornuscusa, by the way, would be a really nice one. One of my clients actually espaliered a magnolia tree, and everyone thought she was crazy, but she had it, and it was a statement piece that everyone remarked on. So growing vertically also has these really fun opportunities to be a little more creative with your structure. So I talked about the tutors. I showed you that tunnel that was made out of bamboo. Well, you can also use this really great they usually use it for agriculture or hardware cloth if you wanted, but use reinforced 3/16 caging trellises, and just bend that down and then have it reinforced with some grade stakes and rebar, and you can grow your crazy serpent gourds like we have here. Or you can get your sugar snap peas or your snow peas, or grow cucumbers vertically. By the way, you're going to have a better uniform fruit if you grow your fruits vertically speaking, rather than keeping them trailing along the ground. So if you look on the left, on the far left, you can see that is a sugar snap pea that's growing up to the top. You could also integrate sweet peas if you so wanted, just as long as you don't eat those flowers. But sweet peas will be a really great all summer bloomer for you. And just these are different systems for thinking what can be vertically constructed. So these images, I was designing for a garden, doing a universal access presentation, and I came across these with wheels. And what I also wanted to point out here too is mainly the fact that we have a palette here on the right. And this isn't really what they refer to as vertical gardening with a palette. It has a modification where they created shelves essentially for the palette. And so they put, and it's against a stucco building. So they were just putting the soil against the stucco with a kind of a V diagonally shaped shelf. So that way the soil and the plant were stabilized, and then vines, the plants would start to vine down, etc. So, but in pallets, usually they are, you know, flat panels on on either side, not as many little boards on the back side as there are on the front side. So what do you do about that? Well, you either add more of those strips of wood on the back, or you can use non-woven landscape fabric, and you can actually line the back of your pallet with the non-woven landscape fabric if you so desired, or plywood. You could just use plywood if you wanted, and that way you're not really allowing any soil to escape from behind. Now the problem is though that potting soil in particular settles. So when you fill up a pallet of potting medium and you think, oh, it's filled to the brim, no problem. Well, over time, throughout that growing season, it will settle, it will decay. It's all organic material aside from vermiculite and perlite. If you add some coir, that's great, but still that's going to decompose. If you added sand, that would help stabilize it some more. You always want to have some mineral content to really stabilize any kind of media that is going to be long-term, more than say one growing season. But ideally what you could do is create little stapled pockets inside, creating these little shelves per little strip of the panel. And then you create these basically mini hidden troughs, like a gutter system essentially. And then the soil is not going to basically bleed all the way down to the base, but more so they are, it's stabilized with these hidden pockets essentially behind the wood strips. And then you can plant into that. And so that way the soil is definitely going to stay upright the whole growing season, and it won't just seep out and erode out from underneath. But I love these kind of concepts of portability and mobility, and growing vertically doesn't have to be necessarily in a stationary location. You can move it around if you felt so inclined, or if you had a project that really you wanted to move with the sunlight, or give yourself from one year to another a little bit of change. It's really up to you. And in this case here, here's some vertical features that, again, are just a little bit, you know, identifying what is vertical per se. And there are these that are these sphagnum moss three-tiered planters that you could do, or you could use this pyramid system that's much more, you know, constructed, but it is a feasible feature, and you can use it year after year after year, particularly if you're using hemlock or cedar, although cedar is a little cost prohibitive right now, but hemlock could certainly last for about 10 years or so. If you use oak, that's wonderful too, white oak in particular. Another rot resistant wood, by the way, if you have resources for it to build these outdoor vertical features, are with larch or with black locust, okay? And I know in New England, we have a boatload of black locust, and although it's a North American native, the Northeast is not its traditional territory from eons ago that it pre-existed, but it has definitely migrated to this environment, to this climate, and being that it's a legume nitrogen fixer tree, it's definitely making some, it's establishing itself in very, you know, rugged terrain, wet areas in particular. And so if you're going to take any of that down, just think about how to repurpose utilizing black locust, or in this, and you could also have larch if, say, your larch trees are declining because of the larch canker that happens. But there's just a number of opportunities of these pyramid systems, and thinking about your edibles in these kinds of systems are really a great, you know, accessibility feature for your otherwise physically challenged users of the garden. So, you know, the lower it is, think about the lower the shelving is going to be, put what is going to be the slowest at yielding. So for instance, what is going to yield the latest in the season? Cabbage, some of the kales, bok choy perhaps, depending on when you've planted it. Just think about the yielding time frame of which you plant these plants in these vertical systems, and those that are much more high yielding and early through the season, and you're going to have more interaction with it on a regular basis, you probably want that at the, you know, most accessible area of that vertical garden feature. It's like thinking about the grocery store, you know, top shelf, bottom shelf kind of thing. What they want you to grab is right there in the middle. So we seem to have that same kind of feature or that same kind of thinking in the garden environment for these vertical systems. Here's just a three-dimensional view of some fun, you know, plants. Again, these are all annuals. That maidenhair is a Himalayan maidenhair. It's not going to be hardy for us here, even though it's in the Himalayas. We have Australian sword fern, bromeliads. Think about shallow-rooted plants, for instance. Bromeliads are really fun annuals to put in vertical systems because, you know, being in the pineapple plant, the pineapple family, they actually don't want to have rich soil. They are more of an epiphytic plant that takes its nutrients mainly from the decaying material in its vase shape of leaves, of blades coming into the center. So that's really how these plants take advantage or prosper is through the air and through the photosynthesis of nutrient derivatation there. Then we have the spider plant. That's a great other, you know, epiphytic kind of house plant. What I love about using coleus is it's very adaptive to a multitude of soil horizons. The shallower it is, it's going to probably be stunted. But what's really neat is you can always crop it. You can always pinch it, cultivate it, take clone cuttings if you so desired. But it's a really fun annual that is very versatile for applications. Ferns are really super. I have a strawberry begonia on the left. That is a wonderful ground cover begonia that strings along. And so again, shallow rooted. Think about permaculture berms like the hugelkulturs. These are vertical features, and the older they are and the higher you keep accumulating material on them, you know, the more vertical they're going to be. So they can definitely be a really fun vertical feature in your landscape. And taking advantage of the fact that perhaps your landscape, your soil in your yard is so darn compacted or has a lot of clay, so you don't really want to grow in that material all that much. So you make into a berm. You basically you get a little trench first off because you want some drainage area. And then the other thing is that trench is where the logs are set in. If you're not familiar with this, I'll tell you a little bit. The logs are set in, and they, as they decay over time, they release wonderful amounts of beneficial bacteria. Mycelium, for instance. There's tons of protozoa and there's tons of mycorrhizae that start to develop into this environment. And then they start to break down more organic matter that will then become available for the plants to take up. So not only are they providing porosity for drainage, they're also working out on the benefits of the nutrient development in that berm. So there's a long explanation about that. Happy to answer any questions, but hugelkultur, it's Hugelkulture. Hugel is the last name of the gentleman from Germany who invented this concept. Vertical in these troughs, these are the coir-lined or the sphagnum moss troughs. I'm okay with the sphagnum moss more so than I am with peat. I'm not a big proponent of using peat, because peat is something that is mined from the depths of a peat bog, and it's not it's sustainable to a point that if we had a cycle of rejuvenating things every 100 years accelerated, then yes, but peat really takes about 150 to 100 years to develop, and that peat bog is so precious for sequestering our methane and our carbon. So we really don't want to use a whole lot of peat in our green industry all that much. Humus material, there's a lot of great substitutes, but sphagnum moss is more shaved off the top, and it does regenerate. So it's a gray area, but at least it's not the peat itself. Again, epiphytic, so look at your orchids. Orchids are really fun for your tropical vertical gardens. Just thinking about that. And, we go into botanical gardens, into these delicious conservatories in the winter time, and we see these tiers of orchids just draping down, and how those could maybe be utilized for an interior vertical garden. Now, with that said, it needs plenty of humidity. So if you are going to have something of that nature in an interior, you definitely need to have something where there's a mister setup, and you do it at a time of the day when there's not a lot of people around, obviously, or you put it in a bathroom, which has a great humid environment on a regular occasion. This was in Maui. This is staghorn fern with an orchid. I don't know the name of this orchid. If somebody else does, super duper. But I wanted to talk more about the plants themselves here and getting inspiration from more of these plant types. So epiphytes, alpines, rock garden plants, and woodland garden plants, or woodland plants, I should say, that really, woodland plants in New England are a common occurrence for us. And they don't like rich soil for the most part. They like fluffy, light, very, malleable kind of soil that really allows their roots to, those fibrous roots to really creep and crawl. The insulation, on the other hand, is that the forest provides a nice, buffer from the desiccation of the open air in say, if you were to do woodland plants in a bright sunny area in the summertime, and most likely it's going to be a bright sunny area in the wintertime, bad selection right there. So that would be more so for your alpines or your rock garden plants. Grasses, short grasses or sedges, those are really wonderful to have in more of those open environments, at least the sun-loving sedges. Not all sedges are sun-loving, most of them are not. But those are some opportunities for which you could, take those habits of those specific plants and the habitat in which they are growing, and utilize them in something, at least in that sunlit exposure and that sunlit application. So here we go. So thinking about ferns, ferns are a really great solution for those shady garden environments. We have a polypodium over here on the right. Polypody is just an example of showing how many of these ferns, or many of these ledge outcropping plants, create their own duff layer as they decay year after year after year, and then they start to spread their roots into that media, into that duff layer that they've developed from their own decay. So they're self-sufficient all the way. But that's not, so it's like, how can we mimic some of these kinds of systems, or emulate some of these systems in a vertical garden environment? Most of our ferns are very shallow rooted, and so we can definitely take advantage of that shallow rooted. They also have wonderful rhizomes. Many of them have rhizomes, or they have, long running roots that store energy along that long running rhizomatous root, rather than a more stubby root system. I also think about, Armeria or Antonaria, pussy toes. I think about sedums for those sunny environments, sempervivums, Those are really wonderful year-round perennials to think about for your vertical gardens, and have had success with those. Dianthus would, you know, some of the hardier ones are like cheddar pink. I think it's called the Gratianop. What is that species? I'll have to look it up. But the very low foliar Dianthus for sure for those sunny environments. Creeping thyme is really wonderful. In the shadier environments, you could get away with Scotch moss, although some people are against it because it can reseed prevalently and they don't necessarily like it in their gardens, but I love it. There's just a number of these really low growing alpine or rock garden plants to consider. I don't typically use anything with an evergreen in a vertical garden. And the reason for that is because I don't want any potential, I'm a little nervous about the fact that in the winter, we've had so many years or patterns at which we warm up through the day and then the nighttime blasts, this cold blast, or the wind is really strong and it just starts to desiccate those leaves or those needles. So I actually don't recommend a whole lot, a large spectrum of evergreens. I guess it just depends on the evergreen that you're thinking of. But you know, maybe Arctostaphylos, but that oftentimes, if it's in the sun in the wintertime, that can get desiccated really easily in the winter sun. If you were thinking of maybe cranberry, bog cranberry, Vaccinium macrocarpon, again, just be sure that you don't have western winds, you know, where the cold winds from the northwest are really going to desiccate. Eastern winds perhaps would be more manageable. So these are some of those low growing shallow systems. This is a photo, this is a kind of a picture frame panel with the poly-coated 1-inch grid wire. And the poly-coated lasts for a little while, but not a whole long time. So it depends on what your wire is that you're using. So the thicker the wire, the better off you are. The thicker the poly-coated coating itself is, the better off you are for long term. So that lobster crate wire grade is definitely, and it's basically the same grade as some of those suet feeders. Those are really great. That's the same kind of metal or wire I would recommend for caging. Anything thinner like chicken wire that's poly-coated, it works for a little while, maybe 2 to 3 years, but it can start to rust. So just keep that in mind. Even if it is poly-coated, maybe 4 to 5 years in that case. On the left, we have the sphagnum moss. This is at a great consignment shop here in Brunswick, Maine, and just using these sempervivum echivarias and sedums. Excuse me. By the way, one other perennial that could really work out if you are in like a southeast, southwest location is Delosperma, also known as the ice plant. You could get away with that kind of a perennial succulent as well. But just fun, creative ideas. So here are some of these modular frames, meaning like they were prefabbed or just, you know, something where you can hang up and then take down whatever. It's not necessarily as permanent of a setup. You can do these indoors or outdoors. Just make sure that the materials and the fabrication is appropriate for the desired application. So for instance, when I was thinking about this, I'm doing a vertical garden class the other day in a few weeks. And when I was ordering some frames for the students, I wanted to make sure that the backdrop was going to be conducive to the setting that I was recommending the students to hang these. So I'm only recommending the systems that we're going to be building for outdoor application, in the sense that there isn't like a rubber liner in the backdrop of it that would enclose the water, or there isn't a plastic liner in the backdrop of it, I should say, because I wouldn't want water to sweat on an interior wall. So definitely make sure that what the wall, the structure is made out of is going to be impervious to the backside of your wall. You want some permeability for the base, in which case you can use that base to be a recycled water system if you so desired. Or it's an area where the extraneous amounts of water will drain into this basin, and you basically pull it out like it's a sock drawer or something, and you pull it out and then you empty it later on if you don't have a recycling pump system incorporated in it. But the longer the vertical garden system is, the more you know, I guess effective of watering systems would be the drip line irrigation ideas. So definitely keep that in mind. Otherwise, if they're small enough, like a 14-inch or an 18-inch, you can just dismount it from the wall or whatever you're hanging it from, and either use a watering can, or if it's indoors, bring it to the sink of your house and just, you know, water it that way with the sink wand. So I would definitely just double check. It's fun. You can do this chalk paint on them and make them more into like, you know, writing notes or a gift, or identifying the herbs that are in the systems. Herbs that really do well in vertical garden systems are those that are not top heavy, and that's specific. That's general for any of the vertical garden plants, is that the plants are not going to be that top heavy. So you wouldn't want to put like, you know, a large hosta leaf in there per se, or you wouldn't want to put a tomato that is going to get, you know, taller than 18 inches. The plants will grow phototropically, but if they start to flower or fruit, and those flowers or fruits are really heavy, it's going to weaken that stem and therefore break, or it will just bend it down and it won't actually grow upwards anymore. So just keep that in mind, that you really want a good mounded habit of a plant, if not a creepy crawly. I have grown Tom Thumb cherry tomatoes in some vertical garden systems, and it was very successful. So those dwarf tomatoes that are determinate are definitely going to be some good varieties. You want to find those shorter varieties. I just wanted to mention price-wise here too, that, you know, a 14 to 18-inch framed wall panel is basically, it can range from $50 to $150, depending on obviously the quality of the construction, but also if you are going to use a drip basin at all that just pulls out. Those with more irrigation line setups in this to the right there, that's more about $150 to $300. You can make up your own for sure with your own palette form, but again, just make sure that it's going to tolerate the moisture on a long-term basis. So vertical can be achieved again in a number of ways, such as the picture on the left was taken when I was in Rennes, France, and this is a common street design or a common area in the city, and it was just an opportunity to kind of, again, elevate a very flat environment and make it more accessible to people of the feasibility or some creative ideas about growing up that doesn't have to break the bank. So, and you can repurpose material. So say if you had a lot of PVC and you wanted to use PVC, you could use that as, you know, troughs. You could cut it so you could create almost like a gutter system of lettuce growing in there. Or you could cut it and create little shelves in there with a strawberry plant coming out of it or so. There's just so many opportunities for which you can think vertically to grow plants. Again, this is just an insert where they just put in a display of different types of plants. It looks a little cheap here and there, but it gives people an idea of what's possible. And I love the fact that it's in this common town area that, you know, it's more about educating and informing the public about these plants rather than saying it's got to be this highfalutin private environment that nobody can see this vertical gardening opportunity. Heucheras are so fun to have in vertical gardens, and they have been successful in vertical gardens year round. The thicker that rhizome, the better off it is going to be storing and overwintering. The thinner, the smaller the heuchera, it's not going to actually, in this case, be as effective overwintering. So just keep that in mind. So yeah, lots of fun. This was designed by a gentleman in Quebec. I've already forgotten his name. Some of you may be familiar with this image, but he designs these three-dimensional double-sided vertical systems that are encaged with the reinforced wire that have more of a 2 to 3 inch grid system, so that you can put a 2 to 3 inch plant in there rather than these little 1 inch plugs that I'll show you. So this is the back of a vertical garden that I designed a number of years ago. It was really an urban privacy feature, and we couldn't go as high as we had hoped because of the code situation for permitting and so forth. Plus, it gets more expensive the taller you go, but this stands 6.5 or 7 feet high. The vertical garden area is 4.5 feet high, wide, and then it's 25 feet long. And the backside is just a trellis, lattice system for, I planted some climbing hydrangea and Virginia creeper in that area. And I didn't actually put in the up-to-date photo, but it's basically covered that whole back wall there. And the reason why I designed it with this taper was because I wanted to actually take advantage of our natural rainfall. So collecting water instead of relying necessarily on irrigation all the time. And as deep as you can go, the better off you'll have for winter storage. So I designed this with a reinforced chicken wire that is poly-coated. And I will say that I have learned my lesson, and I've used a much heavier grade, and I would recommend that everyone do that. It's basically really the suet grade of wire. I don't remember the actual grade number it is, but it's more of a 3/16 to 3/8 grade of wire. And I used heucheras, I used dwarf Solomon seal, the humile, which was wonderful. I used pachysandra, I used Allegheny spurge, I used Canadian ginger, I used Japanese painted fern, I used, this is the only spot I've ever used creeping Jenny Lismachia aurea. I would love it to grow here. It just brights up this very shady area that otherwise is underneath a Norway maple, where a lot of things don't grow in the root system of the Norway maple. We used little mouse ears, blue mouse ears hostas. They've done really well. Maidenhair fern has done spectacularly. So here it is at finish. And I would recommend that, you think about, again, those really lush opportunities where you create some diversity of textures, just like you would find in a woodland environment or a shade garden. The Christmas fern has been very effective. The sweet woodruff, not. So don't use sweet woodruff. It doesn't have as much of a storage capability in its root system as I had hoped. So that's really the name of the game, is the winter storage capacity of these plants to make it really truly perennial. I actually created more of a blanket of moss between the individual plants as well. So this is the Lerner Garden of the Five Senses. This is the Universal Garden Access Area. And these are vertical gardens from just last year, actually. I did a wall just on herbs with English thyme, tricolor sage, and lavender. And then I did a succulent wall. You always, just like any gardening, you want to have the plants that like the same conditions to be growing together. So succulents don't really want to have a lot of water. Or if they're all in the same watering system, what I did is I designed the media to be more porous on the succulent wall. So that way it balances out the fact that it's, even though getting watered once a day at 20 minutes a time, it's not necessarily getting waterlogged, like in the fact that it's not, you know, transpiring as much as the herb wall is, or the edibles of the vegetables on the other wall panel. So I also put Dusty Miller with those succulents because, again, they like to have similar conditions, and I love the Dusty Miller kind of spreading throughout. So here is a mint wall. This wall is just mint with some blue lobelia kind of interwoven and losing the battle, but that was intentional. It was the blue lobelia was intended just to be kind of a beginning, early stages. And the mint has, there's lemon mint, chocolate mint, peppermint, so much to enjoy. And think about when you're so close to that wall and cutting those aromatic plants, it's just so invigorating. So here is the lobster crate wire. These are 1-inch grids. The boxes themselves are individual boxes of 6 inches thick or 6 inches wide by 1 foot, okay? And then we line them with a landscape fabric that is non-woven, and that way it won't, we use this non-woven fabric every, like, it's been at least 5 years that we've used the same kind of material. The thinner it is, the more porous it's going to be, obviously. So you can use the non-woven fabric that's used for the backs of stone walls if you wanted to, for plants that need a little bit more moisture retention for a longer period of time. It's similar to that of the woolly pockets and those smart pots that are used for air pruning, same concept. So we set them on the ground, we fill them up, and then we close them up. I fill them with a coarser grade of potting media. Some years I have it with peat, and some years I don't have it with peat. I've been buying organic mechanics potting soil lately, and using that more and more. And that seems to work out particularly well for the succulents, I have to say. But in any case, or the Mediterranean, you know, drought tolerant kinds of plants. So we set them down for about 2 weeks, and then, or 2 to 3 weeks, just until basically those 1-inch plugs or cuttings, if you're going to do cuttings, root out enough that they stabilize the soil, so that when you prop it up, it's going to be stabilized, and you're not going to worry about, you know, soil seeping out in the face of it from any rainwater, or if the irrigation, you know, when the irrigation is going on, if the soil is really, you know, it hasn't stabilized or settled in. You know how potting soil is, it's very easy to just push and blow around. So we want to make sure that that is a nice stable media before we hang them up. In that picture you saw before, that was a vertical planting all the way, and never set it down. It really just depends on the construction and the you know, long-term expectations. So, and how much you fill it all together. So instead of using landscape fabric all the way around, I used moss on the other one. Whereas here we keep them open on the face without any landscape fabric on the face. So that way there's good aeration. Plants can actually spread and fill out. When I see these vertical systems that are enclosed with the plastic fabric or the plastic liners, it gets moldy and very sweaty, and the porosity is really poor. So I really recommend using porous filter fabric. And if you can help it, don't do it all the way around, only do it on the sides and back, securing the root systems. So again, I talked a little bit about the growing media. I do add compost. I add a decomposed seashell compost with a little bit of manure and leaf mold. And then I add some of my slow release chicken-based pelletized fertilizer, particularly for the edibles. I want to just continue to promote the organics and not utilize Osmocote as much as possible. I do recommend using a coarse sand if you're going to do this for perennial purposes. Particularly using compost will be great for those perennials. And you know, worms actually do start living, you know, they find their way in there. I don't know how they do it, but adding ferns, adding worms is not a bad idea. They just kind of keep things moving along and nutrients becoming available to the plants. But again, these are plants that are not supposed, the perennial walls are really supposed to be with plants that don't need a whole lot of attention and a whole lot of nutrients. They want, in general, a leaner soil type. So again, so I did, you know, if you wanted to do succulents, do 1 to 3. So sand is the 1 and compost is the 3 with fine bark. And don't forget to have your irrigation drip line. This system has a 2-tier shelving system, and I put drip on the underside of the shelves so that it drips down to the lower tier just below it, and it worked really well. So these are those non-woven woolly pockets or woven fabric. You can just go get your non-woven filter fabric and make them yourself. You don't need to have these more you know, manufactured varieties but I will say these are designed to be thicker, and they do have a coating in the pocket themselves that makes the fabric last longer than just a couple of years. So keep that in mind. You can see what happens if the water doesn't get down to the bottom tier and you're only watering the tops and expecting water to drape down throughout all the tiers. That bottom tier does not get as much water if that's the case, that you're only relying on watering the upper tiers. I will say also, if you don't have good sunlight from the morning and rising above, but you only have full sun at the very peak of the day, then your bottom tier is not going to get as much sunlight. So then plant shade plants if that's the case. Don't expect all herbs should be growing successfully on all the tiers. Here's an example in New York City. I really love this. This was done by a school. I think this is a great opportunity for greening up our urban environments. Here's some features for, you know, if you were living on a deck or a terrace in an urban environment. These are some, the one on the left, again, it's a version of a woolly pocket, whereas on the right, it's the wooden cedar troughs or boxes. Design is so much fun in these kinds of programs where you can get geometric, you can be more in, you know, impressionistic with your designs. A lot of people tell me, and I agree with them, the simpler the better, so that way you have an easier management practice and that you don't have to worry about trimming this and that in order for something else to succeed. Really know your companion planting as much as possible. So this is the picture on the right, and on the bottom center are the plants that were in the greenhouse for 2 to 3 weeks, and then we brought them up, and here they are vertically. And we used snapdragons. These are mounding snapdragons. They're really great for an edible wall because snapdragons are actually edible. It's not that they taste all that great. We use compact globe basil or spice basil. We use lemon gem marigolds, which are fantastic to have in vertical gardens because you can trim them and they can re-dome themselves if you so desired. I would not recommend lobelia or alyssum in vertical gardens. They really just don't do all that well. They're just kind of, you know, they're just messy. They don't have a lot of structure to them. So good mounding structure is ideal. We also used an Indian mint. I'm forgetting the name of it all of a sudden, but I actually thought it tasted or smelled like turpentine. On that top left is actually a mixture of perennials and annuals. I used Muhlenbachia with the heuchera there, and I also used Carex pennsylvanica with Selaginella. And that's the shady side. That's the morning sun and shady afternoon, and it really filled out marvelously. Here's another year. We did blue bunny, Carex flacca, with a yellow alternanthera, with the chenille plant over there. I always pronounce it wrong. It's Acalypha, Acalypha, I guess. I used bugleweed, Caitlin's giant. I used fluffy ruffles. It's a Boston fern cultivar, and streptocarpella. I love streptocarpella. It's a great family relative of the African violet. And here it is about a month and a half later. Oh, I'm sorry, that wasn't the bugleweed. That was the Carnival begonia. Excuse me. There it is from the periphery. And curly parsley is awesome. I also use prostrate rosemary in my vertical gardens. Golden oregano is fantastic. I mean, so many of the Mediterranean herbs do really well in these vertical garden features. Here's a year where we did rows of heucheras. And that is a golden carex, by the way. This was setting up the lavender wall with tricolor sage. And then that was on the left, that's the picture of it in the greenhouse. And then on the right, after about, I'd say that picture was taken in July. Just fun designs. I called that the rainbow wall. Here's a design I did last year with kind of this eye, diamond-shaped eye. That's Party Time Alternanthera. We have that purple oxalis, and Australian sword fern actually did really well. It can be dwarfed in these kind of shallow growing environments. And on the left is the edible wall that I did a few years ago with that Tom Thumb tomato. And I also put a mix of kales and lettuces to be trimmed on a regular basis, kind of like a mesclun mix. And we also did English thyme, and I did strawberries. The strawberries were really fantastic. Gosh, I think it was called Blizzard. I think that was the name of it. It was a ever-bearing strawberry, and that was a really good performer in this vertical garden. Edible walls do get a little messier like that. So just keep that in mind if you don't keep up with it. I used lemon balm. And also a dwarf lunchbox pepper in there. And the other thing is, make sure your irrigation is working. If you're going to go away for a week or so, just double check the irrigation lines are set in correctly. Here's another image of that eye, that diamond eye in the wall. And here's some images I wanted to share with you that I saw at the Grand Rapids Botanical Garden. I'm already forgetting the name, but this is a moss wall. And so to keep that moss really vibrant in color, you do have to spritz it. There's no irrigation, there's no soil. They just use a glue, and then they put the moss to that glue, and they create this tapestry of moss. And in order for it to at least, not necessarily grow, but just stay vibrant, you just need to spray it with water every so often. This was at the Berkshire Botanical Gardens, using some selaginellas. Actually, I'm sorry, the picture on the left was at a different setting. That was in, geez, I've been to so many different botanical gardens, I can't remember where I took that one, but it's in an indoor conservatory. Whereas on the center, that is at the Berkshire Botanic Garden in their new event lot barn. And they have, you know, terrace fern, they have just a variety of ferns. And this has a built-in irrigation system. It's a set-in immersed system with a beautiful picture frame panel around it. So you don't have to see all the hardware, etc. And they use this, they have this growing like this, you know, all season, all year in that environment. Again, though, you do need to maintain that there's some kind of moisture level, humidity level, if the building itself is not, if it's too dry, especially with electric heat. So here's some reinforced caging. Again, they lined it with some sphagnum moss. So you could do that as well. If you don't plant into just sphagnum moss, you could also just line it with sphagnum moss and then plant it within a coarse bark substrate. So this is Hoya plant amongst all these different other ferns. So you can see they have this in a shade environment, and that's a carex that is called copper. So it's actually supposed to be brown. And we are at our third slide. So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box so Penny can get them prepared for us. These are walls in Paris, France. You may be familiar with Patrick Blanc. He has been he's led the frontier of vertical gardening for a number of years. And his method has been creating these mural tapestries of plants that, you know what, in reality, they're not always perfect, which is just delightful and refreshing to realize when you see it in person. In this environment, you know, there's seasonal succession that is occurring, but he uses a burlap that is basically the sheet that runs down and then plugged with holes with the plants growing into it. So there's a coir and sphagnum media behind that that burlap, with then a sealant so that it doesn't go through the brick or whatever that building is actually built with. So there's, you know, this was taken end of April, beginning of May in 2017. So it looks like we've got some aruncus in there. I mean, they do have some trees on the top, which is pretty cool. See the heucheras on that bottom right-hand corner? They have euphorbia, so a lot of the Mediterranean plants. But again, just it's not perfect all the time. And that's what I think we all have to realize, is that there is seasonal changes that occur in these living environments. And I just wanted to leave you with this ancient wall that has beautiful, you know, porous opportunities for this artillery fern to grow in. There's a number of, you know, ground cover plants that we would call ground covers that are growing. Speedwells, you know, something like Georgia blue growing in there. It's just, it's really refreshing to see some of these aged inspirations. So thank you. Again, my name is Irene Brady Barber. My email, I have actually 2 emails, and my Instagram is at irene.b.barber. If you are on Instagram, I share a lot of these images on my page for you to get inspiration as well. My Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens email is that in blue, which is ibarber@mainegardens.org. If you also want to talk to me about just a separate contract or any details about other jobs of vertical gardens, my other email is irenebbarber@gmail.com. And there's a reference here, Planting Green Roofs and Living Walls by Nigel Dunnett and Noel Kingsbury, if you are interested. Thank you for your attention. Very much appreciate.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Irene. We have gone way over our 1 o'clock.
Yes.
But I have many questions that, if you have some time and can stick around a little bit, we will get to.
Right, and being that this is recorded, those of you who can't stay, at least you can hear the questions later on.
Great. Good suggestion. So we will get to as many of these as we can. Have you seen rain gardens used as vertical planters, and do you have any tips for using them?
That's actually really interesting. So I guess in that case, I would say that rain gardens in a planter condition could be really effective. I have not seen one constructed for that purpose, but it does seem very sensible, where you could build basically a vertical cistern that could be a slow release feed into the drip line that would then feed into a wall, such as these. So if these were positioned at the drip edge of the or the downspout of say this pavilion that I'm showing a picture of, and you built in a vertical, PVC receiver of that water that had perforation, then I could see that, and it fills up. So that way it actually has the opportunity for the water to then run down the drip lines. That could be a really effective means. I don't know that that's a good, predictable, or reliable source of water on a regular basis. It would definitely depend on your plant choices. So just as a rain garden is designed, you never just plant just water-loving plants. You always want to plant a variety of dry-loving, damp-loving to moist-loving. So similar idea. I think that could be effective. You could also just do a large rain barrel with pockets of soil on the sides that are also kind of like an oversized strawberry. The only thing is you just want to make sure that if you're using a media or what media you use, it's not going to be a soil media. You would want to use more like a sphagnum moss media. So you would choose to use epiphytic kinds of plants for such a scenario. So that way you don't have soil leaching into that water and then end up clogging it.
Good suggestion. This question is about using a chain link fence for vertical gardening.
Yeah, chain link is, yep.
Do you have suggestions for maybe making pockets other than just growing vines up them?
So chain link, you could certainly use that as kind of that one sheet of mat you mat that down on top of an oversized wall panel that you would then be freestanding, or maybe you mount it up. If I'm understanding the question correctly, the only issue I would say is that you definitely, again, the chain link does end up rusting when it has so much of that moisture content on a regular basis, unless you're using a stainless steel, maybe a galvanized aluminum, but I would perhaps maybe coat that before with a Rust-Oleum beforehand. But chain link could definitely be used. You could also use chain link for the vines, for sure. But you could also do woolly pockets on a chain link fence, and that's going to be even more cost effective if you felt like you wanted to do something that was changed out year after year.
Good suggestions. What about native vines like Laniceros sempervirens or Campsis radicans for vertical accents?
I think I mentioned those in the very beginning, but yeah, I would. Oh yeah, and our native wisteria, that would definitely work out. Again, the structure for some, particularly for the ladder plant there, that vine of campus, needs a significant structural, stronghold, because those are so top heavy, and the branching and everything can be heavy. So you would want to thin that out every so often. I would utilize those at the base. Well, actually, you could do it either way. You could have it so that you could have it at the top and create the vining to grow downward, but you'd have to create some training of that. Or if you benefit from having it from the base and letting it grow upward, it would also latch onto the soil easily, or say sphagnum moss. So if you started up a little higher, like in my first vertical garden where I had posts, and I had things growing on the base of it like ferns, and then you wanted to have the vertical garden above that, you could either have the wisteria in the ground, or you could have it at the base of that planter and let it grow and kind of create that mural along the length of the vertical garden.
Good suggestions. Someone is asking about growing things vertically like Asclepias ceracea or Helianthus helianthroides, so they don't invade the ground, but you get them up. Have you had experience with those?
Those are the ones that I would refer not to, or I suggest not to, because they are already specced, and they habit-wise, they grow 2 to 3 feet, if not 4 feet tall. The Asclepias syriacus has a very heavy top when it goes to flower, and that stem is not flexible, and so it will definitely split. And I would not recommend those plants to be in this kind of a feature. I would certainly recommend it being in the quote unquote raised planter opportunity if you wanted, But remember, anytime you let anything go to seed, it will go to seed everywhere. So it doesn't matter if it's in this planter or not. So if you want to contain anything from going to seed, just cut the flowers off before the flower heads have dried completely, before the seeds have set into the pod.
Good. Very good.
Although I wouldn't recommend that for Asclepias because we want more milkweed.
Yes. You mentioned avoiding evergreens, but you also did mention an evergreen vine that
Yes,
works
I did
well in
mention
Maine.
for Euonymus fortunae, which is winter creeper. So that is an evergreen that I used in a trellis system, so that again it has a little bit more, and it's not in a full sun area. That's the other thing, is just as long as it's an evergreen that can tolerate the shade. So even like a yew, you could do a dwarf yew, you could do a dwarf balsam fir, or some of those varieties in a vertical garden, but you definitely want to make sure that they are getting that winter protection from winter sun and wind. So that way it doesn't want to ever break out of dormancy in the heat of the day of say 40 degrees, and then zap at nighttime it drops down to say 5 degrees. They're not going to like that constant change of temperature fluctuation. And as we know, the higher you go, the heat is going to be, the environment is going to be more volatile.
Right.
So you definitely want to keep in mind of your directional exposures for these evergreens.
Very good. What was the comment that you made about the flowers on sweet peas?
Oh, so sweet peas are not recommended to be eaten. They are not an edible pea flower, unlike sugar snap or snow peas, or pea tendrils of the sugar snaps and the snow peas. Sweet peas are not edible flowers.
Okay. We have a few questions about sourcing. One is sourcing for the commercial lobster grid wire. One is questions about sourcing the coir potting mix.
So talk to Mark Hyland from Organic Mechanics. He is the peat-free guru of potting media, and he has a range of different potting media that have different percentages of coir to compost to rice hulls to bark and so forth. So I would recommend, I've also heard Vermont Organics has an opportunity where they don't use peat. My recommendation is you can get a coir block yourself, and you can actually make your own media from that coir block, because that block is dense, like it's almost like a peat block, how dense it is. And when you wet that, it starts to peel apart, and then you can make your own media from your own leaf mold, from your own bark, etc. Yes, there's more involved in doing so, but if you're truly on that kind of more locally resourced opportunity, try that avenue as well if you don't have a 20-foot wall to build right away. The other question, remind me again, I'm sorry. The
commercial,
wire.
the lobster grid.
The lobster crate wire. So a lot of trap companies, meaning the lobster traps, that's what they're referred to, will sell you the wire for re-wholesale, or you could try Hamilton Marine. Many marine stores actually sell the roll of that. So it's a heavy gauge. I kept saying grade. I meant to say gauge. It's a heavy gauge wire. And you can just say it's the rating for lobster traps that you want, and they'll understand. The point of this though too is if you look back at this, you'll see, I guess I can't get it there, but let's see, this has little clasps, okay? And these clasps are what create that structure for you. So if you're going to make it into a rectangle, then you're going to need that. It's the same kind of concept when you build compost bins. You're going to have those clasps. I don't remember the exact name of them. If anybody does, please type that into the chat box, because I am not in the constructed vocabulary. I don't have vocabulary in that world. So,
Okay. Well, we'll wait and see if someone types that in. We have a
yeah.
few questions about fertilizer.
Mm-hmm.
Since you're watering frequently, are you losing more fertilizer than you would in a ground-based installation?
That's a great question.
If so,
Yep.
can you recommend some organic fertilizers? And another associated question is, you mentioned some kind of chicken pellets. Can you describe what they are and where you source those?
So many of you are probably familiar with Espoma products like Plant Tone, Biotone, Polytone. There's another more locally equivalent company up here in Maine called North Country Organics. They have the pellet itself is a dried, aged chicken manure. Okay, and chicken manure, as we all probably know, is very high in nitrogen. And so what they do is they add these micronutrients to that chicken manure so that it has a balanced nutrient ratio, so that you'll get your potassium, you'll get your phosphorus, and then you'll get your molybdenum and blah, 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 with all these other additives that come in these very fine mined forms like azomite, malignor. Oh my God. I'm forgetting how to say it. Malignite, I think. I can't even say it. Anyways, there and calcium, and then there's humus, and it binds to this chicken manure pellet. And so when you open up the bag, you see a lot of these little flakes and flecks, and then also the manure pellets. And they don't necessarily hold their shape all the time during the shipping and blah, blah, blah. But it is, that is the slow release fertilizer that I use. I don't use a whole lot. I only use, in that 6 by 12, I use maybe a half a cup of it, and I really work it into the soil. So it's not just on the top, meaning when it's on the ground, it's not on the top, okay? Because then that would just wash outward once we raise them up. But it's really mixed into the media. And then, yes, that fabric is porous, but being that the nutrients are basically adhered to the aggregation of that potting media, it doesn't necessarily just pour right out. It's not a fast leaching material. The other thing is I want to just mention is, if you see these vertical gardens, these have shelves, and the shelves are really helpful for, you know, preventing any kind of washout or structural loss of integrity. So I hear your point about, you definitely, like, I wouldn't want to use just liquid seaweed and fish emulsion on a regular basis, because it's just going to wash right out as soon as I've used it too, because it's not necessarily binding to the aggregate of the soil.
Right,
So.
right, very good. You mentioned this screening vertical wall that you built, and that it had a slanted side for
Yep.
water. Can you just describe that a little bit more?
So the benefit of having some of the soil, so the face of the wall was at an angle of about, I guess that was about, I don't know, 15 degrees downward. And the benefit of that was I wanted to absorb as much of the rainfall that was naturally getting blown or, you know, fallen into that planter, so that when we didn't have to run the irrigation, we didn't have to run the irrigation, particularly where the soil is deeper at the base. It needs more water to absorb there. So as much water as we can get, that angle was helping to retrieve some of that naturally occurring rainfall.
Okay, very good. How long did you say you leave the grid systems horizontal before they're rooted in enough to put
Yep.
vertical?
So in this case, again, because we don't have any fabric in the forefront, we weren't using any moss, we weren't using any burlap or, you know, anything to kind of enclose the soil while the plants are establishing. Then we like to just set them down. It's a little bit more predictable. Plus, we start them off in the greenhouse early enough in the season that we have a little bit of, time without visitors coming to the gardens, because we don't have visitors year round. So it was about 2 to 3 weeks that I leave them in the greenhouse on the ground. It is very beneficial to do that, especially with cuttings, and especially with cuttings of plants that are slow to root, and then you don't want them to just wash out, or that also with cuttings that are also going to be plants with top heaviness, like an echeveria. The time in which a lot of people will plant and then just hang right up, they oftentimes use little mini landscape staples, and then they anchor that stem cutting into the soil media at that point, in which case, then it holds on. It doesn't necessarily work for all the plants, because not all of them have really good sturdy stems when you take a cutting. So the benefit of laying it down is you give yourself that buying time, essentially.
Okay, very good. You cautioned against evergreens, but you also mentioned that you'd had good luck with heucheras, which are typically evergreen. Can you maybe clarify that?
Yeah. I'm referring more to a coniferous tree or plant. I don't really think of heucheras as I see them more as herbaceous. They're evergreen, but they're not really absorbing a whole lot of they're not storing a lot of energy in those leaves themselves. Most of it is just going right into the rhizome. So unlike an evergreen, it stores a lot of its overwintering capacity in the leaf itself as well. So that's where I'm differentiating the evergreen from the quote unquote herbaceous plants that, like Christmas fern is called an evergreen, but it really doesn't do a whole lot of retention or absorption of nutrients in the winter time.
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification.
Mm-hmm.
And our final question is, do you have some recommendations for pollinators supporting plants to grow vertically?
Well, I mean, all of those edible flower ones are great for pollinators, especially if you're doing edible walls, for instance. You always want to have some plant flowers in there that are going to attract your pollinators to pollinate your fruits or your vegetables. The natives that I mentioned, like the Allegheny spurge, I mean, it's not so much that there needs to be a list of plants that attract the pollinators, but the plants that are native and that can also manage to grow in this very exclusive kind of growing environment. I mean, we all hear, you have to have an environment, or we sometimes have to contend with the limitations of deer landscapes. So we have to also consider the limitations of a vertical garden with our natives. So there's just so many plants to list off, I guess is my point, that I can't really just name 1 or 2 or 3 of them. I would definitely recommend, the anemomellas are really great for attracting our early season pollinators, and those are native. I would recommend our sedges. Our sedges plumes are very important to our native pollinators. There's just a wide array. You could try some of our dwarf prunuses if you wanted to try some woodies in there. There's a variety, I can't remember the name of it, but there's a dwarf prunus, which is the cherry and wild cherry that will grow in the vertical gardens. Something that can, again, tolerate the drought conditions. If you wanted to even try little bonsai, this is where you can get really creative too with beach plum, Prunus maritima. That would be a really fun one to do in a vertical garden by the ocean or such, where it can handle those kind of extreme elements. But again, you're not going to get a bush, but you'll get some really interesting characteristics of those woody stems in there. and they're great for pollinators.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking all this extra time for questions. We really
Yeah,
appreciate that, Irene. And what wonderful ideas you have given us for space saving and accessible gardens. These are all really fabulous. Thank you so
my
much for
pleasure.
sharing these lovely vertical garden ideas.
Thank you everyone for taking the time and staying on. Appreciate it. Thank you, Penny.